I turned 89 on a Tuesday, and by Thursday of that same week, the house I raised 4 children in no longer belonged to me. Nobody broke a window to take it. Nobody threatened me with a weapon or forced my hand while I screamed for help. Instead, they brought balloons. They brought a cake with too much frosting and not enough candles because, as my granddaughter joked, the fire department might show up if we lit 89 of them. They brought hugs that lasted a beat too long. The kind of hug where you can feel someone's heartbeat, but cannot read their intentions. And somewhere between the second slice of cake and the final round of photographs, a folder of documents sat quietly in a leather bag by the door, waiting for a moment when my eyes were tired and my guard was down. This is the story of how a family can smile at you with their mouths, while their hands are already moving toward what they believe is theirs. I want to tell you plainly, before we go further, that I am not bitter. I am not writing this from a place of revenge or spite. I am writing it because I wish someone had warned me sooner, and because I know there are others out there right now, sitting in a kitchen that still smells like their grandchildren's shampoo, completely unaware that the people who call them grandma or grandpa are quietly rearranging the furniture of their future. If that describes you, or someone you love, stay with me. This story will not be comfortable, but it will be useful, and by the end, you will know exactly what signs to watch for before it is too late. My name does not matter for this story. What matters is the shape of my life, because so many of you will recognize it as your own, or your mother's, or your neighbor's. I was married for 51 years to a man who built furniture with his hands and loved with the same steady patience. We raised 4 children in a modest brick house on a quiet street, the kind of street where everyone knew whose dog belonged to whom and which porch light meant someone was still awake. When my husband passed, the house became quieter, but it never once felt empty, because my children visited often, or so I believed at the time. Looking back now, I understand that visits and vigilance are not the same thing, and a house can be full of laughter while still being systematically emptied of everything that matters. The trouble did not begin with a single dramatic betrayal. It began the way termites begin, quietly, in a place you cannot see, chewing through the support beams while the paint on the walls still looks perfectly fine. About 2 years before my 89th birthday, my eldest began stopping by more frequently. At first, this felt like a blessing. I remember calling my sister and telling her how lucky I was, how my son had suddenly rediscovered how much he loved his mother's company. He would sit with me at the kitchen table, ask about my finances with what seemed like genuine concern, and gently suggest that at my age, managing bank statements and utility bills was simply too much of a burden for me to carry alone. He was right about one thing. It was a burden. My eyesight had grown weaker. My hands trembled more than they used to, and the small print on those statements seemed to shrink a little more every year. So when he offered to help me set up online banking, to become what he called a joint signer for convenience, I did not see a wolf. I saw my son, offering to lighten a load I had been carrying alone for years. I signed where he told me to sign. I trusted the pen more than I trusted my own instincts, because after all, this was my child. The same boy I had once carried on my hip through grocery store aisles. The same boy whose fevers I had nursed through countless nights. By the time my second child, my daughter, began visiting more often as well, I had already grown accustomed to a certain kind of attention that felt like love, but functioned like surveillance. She would ask about my will. She would ask so gently, almost apologetically, whether I had considered updating it, whether it truly reflected what I wanted, whether the current version was even legal anymore given how old it was. Every question sounded reasonable in isolation. It was only much later, when I laid the pattern out like pieces of a puzzle, that I understood how carefully those questions had been sequenced, each one preparing the ground for the next. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people, yet still feeling invisible, and I lived inside that loneliness without having a name for it. My children visited, yes, but their visits had started to feel less like connection and more like inspection. They would open my refrigerator and comment on what I had or had not eaten. They would glance at my mail before I did. They would finish sentences for me in front of guests, as though my own voice had become optional in conversations about my own life. I told myself this was simply what happens when your children grow older and start worrying about you. I did not yet understand that worry and control can be difficult to tell apart from the outside, and even harder to tell apart when you are the one being worried over. The turning point, the moment the fog began to lift even slightly, came from an unexpected place. A neighbor of mine, a retired schoolteacher, who had lived 2 doors down for over 20 years, mentioned in passing that she had not seen me at the community center in months. I told her I had been busy with family. She paused. The way people pause when they are deciding whether to say something they think is not their business. And then she asked me a question that has stayed with me every day since. She asked whether I still had access to my own bank statements, or whether someone else had been the one checking the mail. That single question cracked something open in me that had been sealed shut by love, by fatigue, by the simple exhausting difficulty of standing up to your own children. I went home that evening and, for the first time in nearly 2 years, I asked to see my own bank statements directly, not through my son's summary, not through his reassurances, but the actual documents themselves. What followed was a slow, sickening unraveling. Withdrawals I had never approved. A second mortgage I did not remember signing, though my signature was there, shaky and uncertain, dated on a day I now recall as one where I had been recovering from a bout of the flu and could barely hold a spoon, let alone read a legal document with the attention it deserved. I want to pause here and speak directly to anyone listening who recognizes even a fragment of themselves in this story. Financial exploitation of older adults is one of the most underreported forms of abuse that exists, precisely because it so often comes wrapped in birthday cards and family dinners. It does not look like a crime. It looks like help. It looks like love. The people who study this kind of harm will tell you that perpetrators are, more often than not, family members, and that victims frequently delay reporting because they cannot bear to see the people they raised in that light. I understand that hesitation intimately, because I lived inside it for 2 long years. When I finally confronted my son, he did not deny what he had done in the way I expected. He reframed it. He told me he was simply protecting the family's future, that the money had gone toward things I would eventually benefit from, that I was being dramatic, that at my age I could not possibly manage these decisions the way he could. My daughter, when I brought it to her, suggested that perhaps I was confused, that perhaps this was an early sign of memory trouble, and would I like to see a specialist, one she had already selected, one who happened to be a family friend who might be inclined to write whatever assessment would be most convenient for the narrative they were building. This is perhaps the cruelest part of the entire ordeal, and I say this not to frighten you, but to prepare you. The moment I began asking questions, the story quietly shifted from concern for my well-being to concern for my competence. If I was upset, it was because I was confused. If I was firm, it was because I was becoming difficult in my old age. Every emotion I expressed was recast as evidence that I could no longer be trusted with my own life. I began to doubt myself in ways I never had before, not because the doubt was earned, but because it was fed to me daily by the very people whose job it should have been to protect my dignity, not dismantle it. It took the intervention of an outside party, a friend from church who had gone through something disturbingly similar with her own late husband's estate, to finally push me towards seeking real legal guidance rather than family reassurance. She sat with me at my kitchen table, the same table where my son had once so gently suggested I needed help managing my bills, and she told me something I will never forget. She said that love does not need your signature to prove itself, and that anyone who frames a legal document as an act of family devotion is asking you to confuse the two on purpose. With her encouragement, I finally reached out to an elder law attorney, someone with no relationship to my children, no stake in the outcome beyond doing their job properly. That first consultation was one of the most difficult conversations of my life, not because the attorney was unkind, but because saying the words out loud, admitting that my own children had likely taken advantage of my trust, made the reality undeniable in a way that private suspicion never had. There is a particular grief in that kind of admission, a grief that has no name because society does not have a tidy word for mourning the parent you thought you had raised your children to become. The process that followed was slow and often exhausting, untangling joint accounts, reviewing years of financial records, understanding what could realistically be recovered and what had already slipped beyond reach. All of it required a patience I did not always feel I had left in me. But it also gave me something I had been missing for 2 years, without realizing it, which was clarity. For the first time in a long while, I understood exactly where my money was, exactly who had access to it, and exactly what my legal rights actually were, rather than what my children had convinced me they were. I share this story now not to paint every adult child as a predator, because that would be both unfair and untrue. Most families are not like the one I am describing, but some are, and the ones that are rarely announce themselves with cruelty. They announce themselves with unusual attentiveness that has no clear cause, with a sudden interest in your finances that arrives dressed as concern, with subtle suggestions that you are becoming less capable at precisely the moments when asserting your independence would be inconvenient for someone else's plans. If you are an older adult reading or listening to this, please protect access to your own documents. Keep a trusted, independent third party in the loop, someone with no financial stake in your decisions. Review your own bank statement yourself, even if it takes you longer than it used to. And if a family member ever frames a legal signature as an act of love, pause and ask yourself honestly whether love has ever actually required your signature before. If you are the adult child of an aging parent, listening to this with a different kind of discomfort, I would ask you to sit with the story rather than dismiss it. Ask yourself whether your involvement in your parents' finances comes from genuine care or from a quiet sense of entitlement to what you assume will eventually be yours anyway. The difference between those two motivations is not always obvious from the inside, and the people who cause the most harm in stories like mine rarely believe themselves to be villains. They believe themselves to be practical. I am telling this story at 89 years old, not from a place of anger, but from a place of hard-won clarity. I still love my children. That love did not disappear the moment I understood what had happened. And grief and love, I have learned, are perfectly capable of occupying the same heart at the same time. What I hope you take from this is not cynicism toward your own family, but simply a gentle, steady vigilance, the kind that allows love and boundaries to exist side by side. Check your own statements. Trust your own instincts when something feels off, even if you cannot immediately name what it is. And never let anyone, no matter how much you love them, convince you that confusion is simply a natural part of growing older rather than the signal worth investigating. Thank you so very much for sitting with my story today. If it moved you, if it reminded you of your own mother, your own grandfather, or perhaps even yourself, please consider subscribing to this channel Candle of Knowledge, where we share real, honest stories exactly like this one every single week. It helps more than you know, and it helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them most. Take care of yourselves, take care of the people you love, and I will see you again very soon, my friend.